Throughout the series in Elan, we have seen many great weapons. So today, we're going to cover what I think are the 10 most legendary weapons in Elan. While of course these are subjective, I'm basing those decisions on how powerful the weapons are, physically or magically, their creation story, the amazing feats they've been involved in, and just how iconic they are in the stories, to both the readers and the characters themselves. Quick warning, there will be spoilers for pretty much everything. Let's get started. These are Nagan and Tibor, the Frey said, holding the twin cleaves up. Lightning and thunder, each forged from the same batch of metal by preeminent Durg smiths. Sebek grinned, and in that toothy smile, Wraith saw danger. He doesn't just like fighting. He loves it. For our first entry, we have the twin bronze blades of Nagan and Tibor. While these two weapons have gotten a lot of action and have awesome names, the truth is, what makes these weapons so special is their owner. Sebek was one of the greatest mortal fighters ever. Among the Frey, the Instaria tribe were the best fighters. Among the Instaria, the Galantians were the greatest group of fighters. And among the Galantians, the deadliest was Sebek. While their creation by Durg smiths is impressive, this was still before their societies had much improved metals, so it gets a 4. For power, they will get a 2 as they are one of, if not the physically weakest weapons on this entire list. In terms of feats, Sebek was a renowned fighter, and so while we didn't get to see his many exploits, we know they exist. We also got to see Sebek injure a Rao with his cleaves, even though he lost that fight. This might not seem impressive, but this might be the only instance a mortal has ever been able to strike a hit on a Rao in a fair fight where magic wasn't involved, so we will give it a 6. And then for iconic, while among the Instaria and Galantians, Sebek's weapons are well known, among the greater world, they really are lost to history, so we'll give it a 4. Without hesitation, fear, question, or regret, Thrace quietly walked up to the towering monster. She gripped the elven sword in both hands and raised it above her head. Putting the full weight of her small body into it, she thrust the broken sword into the Galarbrin's body. The sword penetrated all the way to the hilt. The essence that was the Galarbrin and the forces that bound it shattered. Next, we have the broken sword of Avampartha. Near the end of the Frey-Human War, most of the remaining Frey Murleith killed those they loved in order to create Galarbrin, the incredibly strong creatures formed by the art. Among those Murleith was Krem, a young Frey who sacrificed his love, Indis. When the war ended, all of the Galarbrin needed to be destroyed, so a sword was made for each, with the true name of the person sacrificed. And those swords were used to destroy each creature. While a sword was made for him, Krem did not destroy Indis's Galarbrin, instead choosing to hide the creature. Thousands of years later, Krem would attempt to exact revenge by killing the current emperor. His plan failed, Krem was killed, and Indis's Galarbrin was sealed in the Tower of Avampartha by Esarhaddon. During Revelations, the Galarbrin was finally released, and the creature, smartly, chose to break the sword, the only weapon that could harm it, into 2 separate pieces. In the culmination of the Galarbrin's attacks, we saw a man named Theron take the blade half of the sword and spear the Galarbrin before being killed. His daughter Thrace would then take the blade half and destroy the Galarbrin. This act made Thrace, later called Modena, the true heir of Navron and empress in the eyes of the Navron Church. So for creation, we will give the sword a 6, since its creation wasn't anything super special, but it was part of the ceremony marking the end of the war and the destruction of the many Galarbrin, which was momentous. For power, it gets a 2, since in the end it is only a sword and a broken one at that. Aside from killing the single Galarbrin, it wasn't that useful. For feats, it really only had the single feat, but that was a momentous one, leading to the crowning of the new Empress, so it gets a 7. And finally, for iconic, it gets a 2, as it is basically forgotten afterwards, many people not even realizing that it was the sword which was the key to the Galarbran's destruction. Plus, it didn't even have a cool name like Indus's Bane. Plummeting with extended claws aimed at Nephron, and backed with enough force to turn stone to powder, the dragon descended. Persephone wanted to look away but couldn't. She had to see. Looking brave and valiant, Nephron aimed his sword at the sky, at the screeching death from above. The moment they collided, the instant the sword blade impaled the dragon, the hilltop exploded. At number 8, we have the Black Bronze Sword, which was used to create Wraith's Galarbran, which Nephron would later use to destroy it. Right off the bat, this gets a straight 10 for creation, as that scene was epic. It was during the Battle of Granford, as the fray were starting to overwhelm the humans at Elan Rist. Turin told Suri that their only hope was for her to sacrifice Wraith in order to create a Galarbran. They decided that the sword they would use should not be a cheap thing, but something worthy of the sacrifice. And Rain suggests that they could make a black bronze sword, which would require copper, tin, gold, and silver. They already had tin. For the copper, they could use Wraith's copper sword, which used to belong to his father. This was the same sword that had started the whole incident between the humans and Frey, resulting in Shagan's death. For the silver, Tressa offered up her silver ring. This ring was a sacred human relic handed down since the time of Gath. And finally, for the gold, Rain, who would go on to become Rain the Great, the dwarven king who reunited his people, offered up his golden torque. The dwarves held annual contests in Lindenland to find the best amongst their ranks in the endeavors important to their race, such as building, forging, and digging. Rain had won his torque when he was crowned the best digger. So, considering that multiple revered and special items were used as ingredients to make the sword, definitely gives it a 10. In terms of power, we're going to give it a low 4 though, as while it could destroy Wraith's Galarbran, outside of that, it is still just a bronze sword. For feats, it gets a 7. It was really only ever used twice, once in its creation, which we've already covered, and then once when Nephron used it to destroy the Galarbran. Though considering that feat got its own cover of one of the books, we have to at least give it a 7. Finally, it will get a 6 for iconic. This was probably not a weapon that a ton of characters knew about or would have recognized, but as a reader, the instant a black bronze sword is mentioned, we immediately think of this sword. Such as when in Nolan, Zephyrin sees the sword in Nephrin's secret area, we immediately knew what sword it was. Malcolm looked up at the spear towering over them and smiled. Then maybe I should name it. People do that, right? Some do. Okay, I'll call it Narsirabad. Excellent name, very fierce sounding. Is it a Frey word? Malcolm nodded. What does it mean? Malcolm smiled. Pointy. While the previous quote was referring to Malcolm's, aka Turin's, spear in the Legend series, number 7 on this list is actually referring to Turin's original spear, Narsirabad. This was while he was waging the first war of Elan, and was going by the name Rex Uberlin. This was probably the hardest weapon on this list to rank, since on one hand, we only ever see it mentioned a couple times throughout all the series, and we never actually saw it except once in a dream/flashback, and even then, we never saw it used. But on the other hand, it was the signature weapon of probably the strongest living character ever on Elan, Turin. There are rumors that we hear about from Trylos that Turin gave up his powers and stored those powers in his 5 most prized possessions, one of which is Narsirabad. If that is true, and the spear holds even 1/5 of Turin's power, This would certainly make it the most powerful weapon in the history of Elan, and it probably would belong as number 1 on this list. But since we don't actually know that the rumors are true, and we haven't ever seen the weapon in use, it falls much lower. For creation, we'll give it a 6, since Turin created it himself, and that was probably pretty cool. For power, it gets a straight 10. Again, we don't know this for sure, but if it holds Turin's power, no other weapon is going to come even close to it. For feats, we will give it a 6. Again, it probably could be way higher, especially if it was used to kill some or all 4 of the other Aesira, but we just don't know. And for iconic, we will give it a 6, since any races who remember Uberlin, such as the Uberon, probably hold the weapon in high regards, but other races probably don't even know the name. Plus, for readers, while we recognize the name, it is barely mentioned in the books. There was a famous prophecy from hundreds of years ago that told about a great hero, a legendary digger of the First Order, who would enter the underworld and retrieve the Sword of Midian and return it to Elan. For the number 5 spot, we actually have a tie. The first weapon is the legendary dwarven blade Riyria. For creation, it is getting a solid 9. It was crafted by one of, if not the, greatest dwarven craftsmen to ever live, Alberic Berlin, who invented gemlocks, crafted the Draken Heart, and apprenticed his father on the construction of Drumendor. This sword was crafted not only of metal mined on Elan, but also an equal amount of metal from a fallen star, making it part Elan but also part Eton. For power, it gets a 5. While with its superior craftsmanship, it probably is a great sword, but we don't know of any additional power it has besides being able to enter the afterlife. For feats, it gets an 8. It was able to physically enter and return from Pyre, something we haven't seen any other weapon do, or any other object for that matter, aside from the Key of Eton. When Rain returned from Pyre with it, it also acted as a signal that would lead the dwarven race to accepting Rain as their new king. So while the sword's feats aren't warfare-based like many of the other weapons on this list, it certainly gets a good score. And finally, it gets a 7 in iconic. If you asked a dwarf, they would probably say it deserves an 11, but among the other races, they probably haven't even heard of it. And for readers, it plays its role as a background plot to the main story. Moya knocked the arrow and hauled back on the bow until the notched end of the shaft was at her ear. In the instant before the arrow flew, Persephone saw Moya standing alone in the path of the giant, a perfect sight. She wasn't shaking, never flinched, didn't cower even though a ghastly mountain was charging at her. Moya was a true hero. And joining Riyria at the number 5 spot, we have our first non-melee weapon, the bow, Audrey. This was the final version of Roan and Moya's attempts to invent the bow and arrow. While its creation revolved mainly around Roan figuring out the ideal build of a bow, it does get a boost in score as the bow was actually made from the heartwood of Magda, an ancient tree over 3,000 years old who lived through the Frey-Durg War and who assisted Suri and Persephone in Age of Myth. When the Frey Myrleith attacked the humans, Magda was struck with lightning, and Roan would end up using her heartwood to construct the bow. So given that, we'll give a 7 for creation. In terms of power, Audrey is a very well-made bow, as evidenced by the fact it was able to endure for hundreds of years between uses and survived over 1,000 years. But in the end, it still seemed to be just a bow, and its great feats were more due to the archer than the bow itself. So we'll give it a 5. In terms of feats, this bow has a lot. Moya used this bow to destroy the demon sentinel Balgargareth beneath Neath. Later, Moya would again use it to slay Udgar, making Persephone the Koenig. In the Battle of Granford, it was used in the archer attack that killed many of the Frey Myrleith, giving the humans a chance against the Frey magic. Moya also performs an impossible shot with Audrey when she deflects another arrow mid-flight to save Tesh. But all of these feats aren't even Audrey's most impressive. Over 800 years after Moya's death, Zephyrin would use the bow to kill 6 Oberdazas in order to bring down the shield over Persepolis, thereby letting in the human armies and saving the city from Gazelle. Rather than directly aiming at the Gazelle, she aimed high. One last inhale, then she let her breath out slowly and released. As fast as possible, she knocked, pulled, and released arrow after arrow, starting high, then reducing the arc of each shot. The arrows didn't hit their targets at exactly the same time. The little guy on the right died half a heartbeat later than the 3 on his left, and the remaining 2 went down a whole 3 beats behind the rest. So given all these feats, the bow gets a 10. And finally, for iconic, we'll give the bow a 7. Stepping forward, Roan laid the bundle down, then unfolded the cloth, but never touched the sword. The blade was the most amazing thing Persephone had ever seen. The metal was brilliant silver, but around the edges where the shadows pooled, she saw a blue tint. The blade tapered elegantly, every line straight, and the handle was built out of the same metal, making Persephone believe it was all formed from one solid piece. Not nearly as decorated as Wraith's sword, or even as stylish as any of the Galantians. This was perfection through simplicity. The Sword of the Word was the weapon with which Suri destroyed the Galarbrin she created by sacrificing Bina. At first glance, its creation might not seem like much. The dwarves of Carrick, overseen by Ronan Bryn, creating a very well-made iron sword. But when we zoom out and take into consideration that Roan and Bryn were actually at the making to watch and observe in order to learn the secrets of smelting iron, the truth is that the making of this sword unlocked a new age of metalwork and weapons for an entire race. This, along with what Bryn and Roan found on the Agave tablets, allowed the humans to create their own iron and eventually steel weapons, which gave them a fighting chance against the fray. So for these reasons, the sword gets a 9 for creation. In terms of power, it is still just a very, very good sword, whose only special ability is destroying the specific Galarbrin it was created for, so it's going to get a 5 there. In terms of feats, it does have many. It of course was used to destroy Mina's Galarbrin, and we already talked about how it helped humans discover the art of iron weapons. It doesn't stop there though, as this sword would eventually fall into the hands of Brigham Killian, who was the first human trained by Tesh to achieve competence in all 7 of the Galantian disciplines. Brigham would pass down this training along with the sword to his descendants, and eventually it would fall to Amicus Killian. Amicus was probably the best blade master of his time, and would assist Nolan in becoming emperor, and would co-found the Teshlar Guild. Amicus used the Sword of the Word as the largest of his 3 swords, which would make it the precursor to the Spadone of the Teshlar Knights. So for its feats both during the Human Fray War and in the hundreds of years after, it gets a 7. And finally, in terms of iconic, it gets a solid 9. If there is ever a sword with the word Galarabrin etched into it, every reader knows exactly what it is, sharing the same reaction of awe that Nolan had when Amicus first showed it to him. Does she sing when she travels the air, catch the light around her and trap it in her blade? Never grow dull even if used as a shovel or an axe. Cut through steel, cut through other blades. Oh yes, she's an elven blade, boy. Drawn from stone and metal, formed in the heat of the world, and tempered in pure water by the first ones, the children of Pharaoh. At the number 3 position, we have the Fallid, which is Frey for Tooth of the Dragon. This was the Galantian Tekchin's blade. Its creation is a bit hard to determine because we don't actually know when or how Tekchin came to possess the blade. Perhaps it was passed down through his family, or perhaps he gained it on his own. What we do know is that this blade has shown itself to be stronger than steel, but existed in a time before steel had even been discovered. This could mean that there was a strong magical element to it, that it was a remnant of Uberlin's first war, or maybe both. So we will give it a 7, though perhaps it should be much higher. Next, we get to power and feats. But before we give it scores for those, we need to explain the lifetime of this blade, as most readers are probably not aware that this sword is the only weapon that shows up in every single series set in Elan. I'll give everyone a moment to let that sink in. So let's start at the beginning. Tekchin obviously used this sword during the Legend series, and he is such a master with it that the Teshlor discipline of the single sword is born out of him. And we see Tekchin use his combat skills very successfully multiple times. After the Empire is created and the Legend series concludes, Tekchin of course survives and goes on to found an order of blade masters named after the sword, the Order of the Fallen. This order would keep the Tekchin discipline alive, outside of the Teshlor Knights. After Tekchin dies, the sword would go to his daughter Zephyrin for a time, but after Zephyrin is killed, the order would take the sword and pass it down through their ranks. Eventually, the order would die out, but not before they passed down the Tekchin fighting style and the sword to a human, Cedric Picklearinon, forefather of the Pickering family. In modern-day Riyria, it would be Count Leopold Pickering and then his son Muavin who would wield the sword. It is through them that we see just how strong the blade is, such as when the Count fought another sword master, Percy Braga. Braga lunged, nicked Pickering's side, and, sweeping back, cut him shallowly across the chest. Pickering barely blocked a second stab with a quick parry, which allowed him an overhead stroke. Braga raised his sword to block, but Pickering ignored the defense. He swung down with force and speed, streaking light from his sword. Hadrian instinctually cringed. The high, overpowered stroke would leave Pickering vulnerable, open to a fatal riposte by Braga. Then the metal of the swords clashed. A brilliant spark flared as, incredibly, Pickering's blade sheared Braga's sword in two. The Count's stroke continued unabated into the Archduke's throat. The Lord Chancellor collapsed to the floor, his head rolling a foot away. It is also in Revelations where we saw Magnus, the dwarf craftsman, admire in astonishment the blade, giving us the description in the intro to this entry. So now let's give it a score. For power, it gets an almost perfect 9, as this blade is not only incredibly physically strong, shearing through steel and lasting thousands of years, but there seems to be some magical quality to it. And for feats, it gets a solid 7. It may actually deserve higher, as it probably has done much more we didn't see while in the hands of Tekchin and the other Order of the Fallen members. And in terms of iconic status, we'll give it an 8. The tutor ran his hand along the sheathed blade. This is a remarkable weapon, a knight's sword, tarnished with time and travel. You don't use it as often as the others. The bastard and the short sword are tools to you, but this is something else, something revered. It lays concealed in a paltry sheath, covered in clothes not its own. It doesn't belong there. This sword belongs to another time and place. It is part of a grand and glorious world where knights were different, loftier, virtuous. It rests in this false scabbard because the proper one has been lost, or perhaps it waits for a quest yet to be finished. It longs for that single moment when it can shine forth in all its brilliance. When dream and destiny meet on a clear field, then, and only then, will it find its purpose. When it faces that honorable cause, that one worthy and desperate challenge for which it was forged, and on which so much depends, it will find peace in the crucible of struggle. For good or ill, it will ring true or break. But the wandering, the waiting, the hiding will at last be over. This sword waits for the day when it can save the kingdom and win the lady. At number 2, we have a fan favorite, which is Hadrian's Spadone. And while it was mostly known as Hadrian's, this sword has a long and impressive list of owners. Originally, it was crafted for one of the 2 founding members of the Teshlor Guild, Gerald de Martefeld. So while we don't know much about its making, we can assume it was made by the best smiths the Empire had to offer for the newly established Teshlors, giving it a 6. The blade would go on to be passed down among the most renowned Teshlor knights, landing with Morgan Rawlings, a Teshlor who is known for his dedication to uncompromising ideals, personal integrity, and an unassailable reputation for honesty, fairness, and wisdom. After his death, he left the sword to Jerish, perhaps the best swordsman alive at the time, and after the destruction of Persepolis, the last remaining Teshlor and guardian of the air. The sword would continue to be passed down through the Guardian's line, finally landing on Tramus Dan, whose son, Hadrian Blackwater, would eventually take the sword and leave home. The sword itself, while a very good sword that is upheld for over 2,000 years, is again mainly dangerous due to the exceptional wielders it has had, and so gets a 7 for power. In terms of feats, it has many, the foremost being the climax of Riyria Revelations, where Hadrian defeats Irawandona with the Spadone, claiming the Faneship for Royce and stopping the Elven invasion. But we can imagine that there were many times the Spadone was used by Teshlors in defense of the heir. Just look at this scene where Monsignor Bartholomew tells Hadrian about what happened the night the heir died. Your father, surrounded by his own set of knights, cried out and dropped his 2 swords. I thought they had stabbed him too. I expected to see him fall, but instead he drew the Spadone blade from his back. The bloodshed I witnessed up to that point did not compare to what followed. Tramus Dan, with that impossibly long sword, began cleaving the Surret to pieces. Legs, arms, and heads. Explosions of blood. Even across Lower Street, I felt the spray carried on the wind like a fine mist on my face. The feats of this sword earn it a 9. And finally, for iconic, this gets a perfect 10. While in the story, some characters might not recognize the sword, among readers, the Spadone is always one of the favorites. Any dwarf in Elan would give his beard for the secrets of Tur, or even the chance to study a Tur blade. And you think Alverstone is a Tur blade? And for the number 1 spot, we have Royce's dagger, Alverstone. This magical weapon came directly from Turin himself. While Royce was in Manzant prison, Turin, under the guise of Nim, gave Royce the blade. Turin did state that he had not smuggled the blade in, which means Turin either made it in the prison or made it long ago and had stashed it. Either way, this dagger gets a solid 7 for creation. In terms of power, this blade acts unlike any other weapon, with how easily it cuts through things like wood, bone, or even iron. But it goes far beyond that, as this blade does many things which should just be impossible. Hadrian was able to use it to harm a Galarbrin, a being that is immune to all other weapons that do not bear their name, as well as all Elan-based magic. So whatever power Alverstone commands supersedes that. Another crazy instance is in Disappearance of Winter's Daughter, when Villar possessed a stone gargoyle. Royce stabbed the gargoyle in the chest, and not only did the dagger puncture the stone, but when Villar awoke, he could feel the pain in his own chest. The magic abilities of this blade are so strong, we don't even know how it works, as there really isn't anything to compare it to. Another note is that when the dwarf craftsman Magnus saw the Fallid sword, which was number 3 on this list, he said that, "No finer blade have I laid my eyes on, save one." That save one was Alverstone. So for power, Alverstone gets a perfect 10. In terms of feats, we already listed some, but another big one is that Alverstone is what finally killed Mwandale, who could be argued was the largest antagonist of all of the Elan series. So for feats, it gets a 9. And in terms of iconic, as a reader, it is extremely iconic to Riyria. And while in the series, side characters may not recognize the dagger, a craftsman like Magnus certainly did. So it gets an 8. Here are the overall rankings for all 10 of the weapons we went through today. Let me know in the comments if you would have ranked anything differently or thought I got something wrong. This was just a super fun topic to discuss and make a video about, so I'm curious to see what everyone thinks. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Be sure to subscribe and watch my other videos to learn more about the world of Elan and Riyria. Thanks!